And we're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Broadband Money's Ask Me Anything session. I'm Sarah Lai Sterland, Broadband Money's Director of Digital Community. I'm very happy today to welcome Elliot Noss to talk about the business of building Ting Internet, a next generation fiber optic internet service provider. Elliot is a CEO and director of Tucows, of which Ting Internet is a subsidiary. And in case you are wondering, Tucows, or short for the Ultimate Collection of Windsock Software, that's what it's short for. But that's the whole other story. And if you don't know the story behind that, just go and look it up on the internet. Tucows is a global internet services company, and it's based in Toronto, Canada. The company runs the second largest domain name register in the world through a group of subsidiaries, and it operates Wavelo, a software system for telecom companies. By my quick count, I could be wrong, Ting operates or will operate in 15 cities across the United States. And we wanted to have Elliot on here, obviously, because Ting Internet is a pioneer in the broadband industry. And also, Elliot himself is among the internet pioneers. He's been working in the trenches for decades, fighting to keep the internet open. So, welcome, Elliot. And my first question for you is: I'm not. We've met virtually. We haven't met in person. So I'm not sure. Are you a Canadian? And if so, what's the biggest misconception that Americans have about Canadians?
Uh, that's a great question. I am Canadian. I am, Toronto. I am born and raised, and less than 50% of the population of Toronto is born and raised. So, that makes me kind of a minority in that sense, because it is the most multicultural city in the world. I would say, what's it's not that we're too polite because we are. I say sorry just like every good Canadian, whether it's my fault or not. It's probably that we are more like a foreign country. It's still amazing to me to watch Americans who come to Canada get thrown off by tiny little differences. And so it's probably that we are so much more similar than different.
Right. Well, I feel being half English myself and spent most of my life in England, I feel a lot of kinship with Canadians.
Oh yes, but you are much more different than Americans than we are. So
That's true.
it's we are this beautiful hybrid between the two of you.
Right. Um, we could have this an endless conversation. Also, Toronto is probably, and I also dispute the fact that I think New York City is more diverse than Toronto, but they're very
I
similar.
have a very specific metric that I use. Uh, Population where there is 100,000 native speakers or more of a foreign language, of a non-English language, and Toronto leads the world by that metric. So
Okay, well, I'm not going to have this, but what about Queens? It's the most diverse linguistic spot on the planet. So there. But
I,
anyway, I'm an ex-New
that's
York.
our next AMA.
Yes, right. So, tell us a little bit about Ting. It's been around for about 7 years, right? What made you
2014. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So, what made you want to get into the business from doing all the other geeky internet plumbing things
Yeah.
that you do?
So I don't and have never thought of it as getting into the business. For
Okay.
me, I grew up uh, professionally, in the very early ISP space. My roots are inside of dial-up ISPs and the first wave of ISPs. For me, this is getting back into the ISP space, and really, it was uh, kind of the structural, financial, political things that had us leave that space in, let's call it, the late 90s, along with just about every other dial-up ISP. And now the window opens to get back into it in the US. The two things that I think people miss, one about Tucows, one about the sort of the macro environment, about us, all of our businesses have been deeply connected to ISPs. Our software libraries, gained prominence by partnering with over 1,000 ISPs in over 100 countries. That was the way we built that business, was because we understood ISPs and the need to preserve bandwidth in a dial-up environment. OpenSRS, we invented wholesale domain registration because we understood that ISPs, and this is before web hosting companies existed, we understood that ISPs and then web hosting companies were the entities that really sold domain names. And so, we created something that was tailored towards them. We viewed our entry into mobile, Ting Mobile, as sort of a mobile ISP. It was data on a small computer network, on a small computer, instead of voice on a telephone. So,
Oh, right.
that's always the way we viewed it. And, I almost think about it as if I was biding my time professionally until we have this, this sort of fiber renaissance. And at a macro level, I think people underappreciate that. We do so much on the internet today, but the internet generally pre-fiber was delivered on infrastructure created for telephones and then televisions. Fiber is the first purpose-built infrastructure for the internet, and America in particular, US in particular, is late in the coax to fiber transition. But in typical American fashion, boy, is it coming in a hurry now.
Right. So, that's after the pandemic. I mean,
It's all in place before then. We really
right,
started to see, um, the early wave of kind of competitive fiber builders. Um,
right,
we were in 14. There were certainly, a good half dozen like us in size and scope that were preceded that. And for everyone, it was seeing what had happened in Asia, in Europe. It was inevitable.
right,
And by the time the pandemic started, the bulk of the capital was already being assembled. There's
right,
so much private equity money now supporting generally ex-telecom executives, in
right.
building platforms to build
Yeah,
fiber. And so, I really think that that was gonna the pandemic accelerated that, but
right.
didn't create it.
So, what's Ting's business model?
We very simply build and operate fiber networks. I separate those two things. Again, I don't think it's made explicit enough that funding and building fiber networks is a 18 to 36-month exercise. Operating them is a 100-year exercise. And so much focus and energy goes into that first 18 or 36 months, not enough into that operating for 100 years. So we build as much as we can. That's primarily because, in our view, still so much of the financial reward goes to that part of the exercise. But we also operate on partner networks, both with private companies and with public utilities or cities. So, we view ourselves strategically as an ISP, and then tactically we'll build networks as well.
Okay. So, well, there's so many questions to ask. I mean, the part about the 100 year and operating and dealing with people.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about not becoming the most hated company in in retail or
Yeah,
whatever?
look, that feels easy. When you think about, how are we thinking about not becoming. I grew up in a world, the early dial-up world, where independent, entrepreneurial-driven companies were killing the telecoms in the space. You know, if you looked in the 95 to 2000 timeframe, every population center in the world, just about, unless there were huge restrictions on entry, licensing restrictions, and there were some countries where that was the case, it was a small independent ISP that was the leader. Now, you'd still often see national telecoms at the top of the tables because they'd be in every city. So they might be the fourth or fifth most popular, but in every population center, where, you know, the smaller independents tended to be in one or maybe two or three, because these telecom is a local business, and it was manifest so beautifully in that time period. You know, we brought that, let me call it, focus on the customer satisfaction through every business we've been in. You know, we were able to, in the mobile phone business, have the highest net promoter scores in the world, as far as we knew, in mobile phone. This is in the 2011, you know, starting from 2011 timeframe. And, you know, we had net promoter scores that were like Apple and Amazon, where, you know, in the 60s, high 60s and low 70s, where telecom, you know, would be in the teens or single digits. And so, you know, we have always viewed this as the case. Our customer engagement scores in the ISP are higher than our mobile scores. You know, we had Consumer Reports identify us pretty much every year for 5 or 6 as either number 1 or number 2 in customer satisfaction in the US. And that's the one sort of award that you can't buy, you know, unlike,
Right.
you know, JD Power
Yeah.
things. And so,
Right.
you know, we never, I mean, we don't give that a second thought. But our bar is not set at, you know, being more liked than Comcast or Charter, I assure you.
Okay. So I want to. I've got a lot of questions still for you, but I guess my last one from me for now is: what are the criteria you have for when you enter these different communities, and when can you come to Los Gatos, California?
uh, well, I mean, aren't you in Sonic country there? Like, isn't Sonic?
I think Sonic's up north. They're in Napa, and I think you can get them in San Francisco. But
Oh,
I
you
could
can,
get
yeah.
Cruzio. I can get. I might be able to get Cruzio. I'm not sure. They're in Santa Cruz.
Yeah, they're supposed to be pretty good too. I haven't heard of them, and
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of them in a couple of years, but I know Sonic is
Yeah.
all in and around there. Uh, so, you know, I think that criteria has been changing over time. If you're asking me that question in June of 2022, it really is the case now that there is so much capital chasing this opportunity. There's a joke inside of kind of the, you know, let me call it the fiber banking circles, that if you added up all of the spreadsheets for all of the funded platforms today, you'd get to about 350 million homes, and there's only 140 million homes in the US. So there is, you know, there, in this game of musical chairs, you know, when the music stops, there's going to be a number of people who don't have seats. So today, it's really about finding the intersection of cities, towns, communities where they are very eager for fiber. There is a huge benefit if they are open to microtrenching, because that really facilitates the speed of construction and can be done safely now, and has a lot of baggage and misconception, but, you know, boy, is it the best way to go today. You know, particularly, by the way, and I'll digress just a second, the number one political issue for cities when they're laying in fiber, cities or towns, is, you know, if you're on the political side, then people will complain because it's construction and roads will be narrowed and, you know, inconvenience will be had. Microtrenching so minimizes that. And I think that's underappreciated. So that would be the second thing. You know, we really like cities or towns that are engaging with us. And so by that, I mean, they need to appreciate that this is probably going to put more strain on the Department of Public Works on permitting than they've seen since whenever their cable network was built, 70s, 80s, 90s. So that means, you might have to go from this many permits to, this many permits. And what are you doing at a staffing level? And how can we help? And how can we work together? And how can we streamline? We really don't just sort of, oh, we're entitled to the public right of way, we're going to build and start applying for permits. So we like a fair level of city engagement. We also like that city engagement because it gives us the opportunity to work with the city on digital divide issues, equity issues, other challenges that they may have. They may have their own internal needs. The number one reason why cities or towns have built a little bit of fiber themselves is because when their anchor tenancy, so providing fiber to city hall, city offices, police, fire, when their contracts come up for renewal, smart CIOs or smart directors of engineering realized that for the price they were going to pay, they could build their own fiber and really control their own environment and get a better outcome. So again, that's I'm laying out. It's not a precise formula, but it's very much around forward thinking. Because again, I deeply believe that we're in a time where time is much more important than money.
Yeah, you did say that briefly to me beforehand, but I'm curious to just get a bit more specific.
Sure.
A lot of our audience and community members are, state broadband offices. There are other ISPs. There are local communities looking to get hooked up. And I just came
Yep.
back from this conference called Mountain Connect in
Yep.
Keystone, Colorado. And the broadband director there, Brandy Reiter, was talking about the urban fringes and how hard it is. That we were talking about funding, and every state is looking for funding. Every community is looking for funding. Um, and I know you guys are in Aurora, Colorado. Um,
Centennial
oh,
and
right, in Centennial,
yeah.
but you're going
Aurora
to
is
go to
it's
Aurora.
announced, but we haven't started building in Aurora.
Oh, sorry, right.
Yep.
How did you decide to get to wire up those towns, for example?
Yeah, look, Centennial and Aurora are two relatively affluent suburbs, middle class, upper middle class suburbs. So those are not difficult decisions. Those are the easiest decisions. You don't have to deal with the cruft of more dense and more challenging urban environments, and you're not dealing with the remoteness that you are the further you get away from urban environments. And so those are easy. There I just refer you back to my previous answer about those kind
Yeah.
of filters for engagement. I would love to go a level deeper, and these dialogues are happening now. So let me put a bookmark I'll come back to. But in understanding what what sort of what's meant by exurb there. I know what that looks like in Denver. I now know what that looks like in Colorado Springs, where we're partnering with the utilities. So, we're really seeing, and I think you'd have both you and Broadband Money, a deep appreciation for how a lot of these broadband offices are just getting spun up, right? So the dialogue and the engagement, is just starting around things like this. I'd love to hear from any of the broadband leaders, where their problems are, where they perceive their problems are. And the other comment I'd make there is, for me, the funding is what the funding is. It's fantastic. It's a massive pot of money. I love the idea of the bulk of what I'll call the construction funding being focused on unserved. I think that's appropriate. But I think there is a much more challenging problem with digital divide or equity, with usage, than there is with construction. For all of the reasons that I described earlier, all the private equity money, all of people's focus on construction and financing rather than operating an ISP. I would have loved to have seen. I'm going to be rough in my numbers. I could be wrong, but it's like I think it's like 46.5 billion in total, and of that 11.5 is focused on digital divide or equity or usage, and the bulk, so let's call it a quarter and three quarters. I'd much rather it was three quarters on usage and training and devices, and one quarter on construction. I think we would get so much more bang for our buck. So
That's interesting. Well, some of it is, some of that 46 million is, I mean, the administration is trying to, make everything. They're not doing one thing and then the other. They're doing everything at the same time.
yeah,
But anyway,
yeah. But the
um,
allocation, the
yeah,
relative allocation, if you think about it
right,
as I understand it at its simplest, and I'm
yeah,
happy to be educated on this,
right.
is kind of three quarters construction, one quarter other stuff.
Well, yeah, the majority is towards
Yeah,
construction. Yeah.
yeah,
Um, and I will that whole digital divide. I know you guys are very interested in digital inclusion as well, but I want to get to these questions.
yeah.
From Drew, who you probably
Sure.
Drew Clark,
Yeah.
Broadband Breakfast. Um, he asks, per your experience in Westminster, Maryland, would you rather only operate as an ISP on an open access network, or both operate as an ISP on an open access network and also own the underlying open access network? So do you prefer to just be on an open access network, or do you prefer to own a network?
It's all going to come down to the terms, and one of the things that we all talked about a little bit in advance, in some of our prep here, is I do think that, and I think this was covered in the prep article, that there is not a robust ISP community today, and I think that makes the promise of open access a little bit ahead of the reality. In 2015, when we did what we did with Westminster, that was very explicitly to try and motivate more open access networks. The very forward-looking city councilor in Westminster that I worked with very closely on that, he had the right vision. I wanted to support that vision. It's a of all things, a pediatrician named Robert Wack, and I wanted to support that, and I wanted to try and help create a model. In a lot of ways, that happened. It got a lot of attention, but what it doesn't have is a bunch of young entrepreneurs coming into the space. So I think that's going to take some time to ripen. So right now, I almost look at that as a false choice. It's I don't. I love the idea of open access networks. Just as that, as the idea. I think the reality is hard to accomplish today. I'm very open to try and help that reality come about. But I've got to do that in the context of running the business as well. So, it all comes down to the situation and the terms. I think, when you talk about sort of owning and operating on the network, they're what I think about. Let me separate finance and construction, because generally finance is borrowing money. Generally construction is hiring contractors. So to me, that means, are you the GC or not? Who's going to be the general contractor or not? Kind of. It's as simple as that. But when I think about your question, I think about it more through the lens that we're used to in our wholesale SaaS platforms, where do we want to be running a software stack that allows small entrepreneurial ISPs to jump on and off it? There just isn't enough there today to really develop that. We've looked at the one or two opportunities in the space. I think there's some nice stuff, but there's just not enough there to really invest in it. So I would say I'm always
So
watching it.
they're not enough. They're not enough entrepreneurs wanting to build networks on open
No,
access
no,
networks,
not at
is what
all.
you're saying.
Lots. You've
Oh,
got, well, entrepreneurs. I don't know what you'd call telecom executive funded by private equity, but let's call them
right.
entrepreneurs.
Okay.
Let's be. It's so, and No, there's lots of people who want to build networks. There's not a lot of people who want to operate, right? People don't want to
Right.
get into the messy business of taking money from people and answering their questions. And look, being an ISP in 1995, it has one through line to being an ISP in 2022. You are selling your customer the internet. That means you need to be prepared to help them use the internet to all of its capabilities. You know, that's hard, thankless work in many respects. And
Can you say, Elliot? Can you say a bit more about that? Because that
sure,
goes into the digital inclusion thing,
absolutely.
and you're actually operating an internet service provider. So tell policymakers and broadband people who are either watching now or later, like, what do you have to do to help people? Like,
Look,
what is every
yeah,
day?
yeah. At a day-to-day level, it's helping people use the internet, whatever that means. So I'll do this, by analogy, or with some stories. We have
Okay.
a fairly large, well thought of domain name retailer, which is hover.com.
Right,
We
that's one of
will
your
get
companies.
we will get 5 calls this week for Hoover vacuums. Our customer service people will pull up the manual. It's usually an older person who didn't know and misspells hover, and we unlike, go to the typical telecom and try and find the customer service number. When you go under the sheaths of web pages that it's buried, with us we try and put that there prominently, right? So we get calls often from old people. Our customer service reps will pull up a manual and try and help it. So there's a example number one. Example number
Right.
two, in our mobile phone business, you would get questions like, which music service should I use? Spotify or Apple, right? Now, what is the telecom answer? I'm sorry, we don't provide that service, and then they'll send you an email with a list of things that they don't support. And by the way, I'll only help you if you're using this particular browser. And if you're not, go download it. How do I download? I don't, we don't support how to download, all of that, versus
Right.
an engaged conversation about the pluses and minuses between the two, right? This is the same. Now, if you want to get through digital divide, equity, what a lot of people generally don't have devices. They're using a phone. So
Right.
you got to get through the device thing. But then, if you've never consumed the internet on a laptop or on a tablet, it's a very different experience than the mobile internet. And
Right.
just using it in any event, using either of them, there are a
Yeah.
lot of very simple questions. So to us, to me, what is an ISP's role there? It's to help people use the internet. And
That's
look,
so
that's just
interesting. So
built into.
basically,
Go ahead.
ISP should take a more active role in all these discussions about digital inclusion, and maybe like come up with um the top questions and queries, and
I mean,
ask for help.
you've gone nicely to a, well, here's a more efficient way to do it. So I think what you've
Yeah.
said is great. you know, I'm that to me is step four. Step one, let's acknowledge that ISPs should want to take on this problem, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
I can tell you that's from my roots in the very early dial-up days, where you sold someone the internet. They hadn't heard of the internet before they bought it from
Right.
you. And so it's just a different, kind of, core feeling about what the service is.
That's a really interesting way of putting it. You have to sell someone the internet. I think the pandemic sold us all on the internet. I mean, my aunt, who hates technology, would meet with her church members. She finally learned how to
Yeah.
use Zoom and things
Yeah.
like that. Uh,
Just go down there, right? Now imagine that your aunt, um, wanted a little help using backgrounds, right?
Yeah.
Well, who should she get that from? Zoom technical support? Or, do what you or I might do, which is search on the internet and watch a YouTube video and, right? Like, so think about,
Yeah.
and let's use her as she's a digital divide person.
Yeah.
Age is one of the key differentiators,
Yeah.
right? What's her preferred mode? I'd like to pick up the phone. By the way, we don't have an IVR, so you get a human answering on a ring or two, which
Oh, wow.
generally freaks people out. And when they experience it for the first time. But by the way, because we all are so human, by the third time, if it takes 3 rings, they're pissed off. So it's we all are who we are. But there's the mode for her, right? There's the right mode to solve her problem. So it's a beautiful example.
That's so interesting. Okay, so back to some serious topics. Well, that was a serious topic. Um, Mike Falloon, our brilliant co-founder, asks, "Are you looking to acquire any ISPs, or will your growth be all organic?"
Uh, what I would say is, let me start first at a macro level. I think you're going to see this build out. I think now, and now I'm going to talk about fiber. Um,
Okay.
I think you're going to see this build out. I believe in, starting probably 3.5 years, and then for the next 5 or 6 years, you're going to see a fairly significant wave of consolidation, like we saw in cable. It'll happen faster and in a more compressed fashion. We certainly, we believe we're the best ISP in the world. We believe that ISP differentiator means your networks are more profitable, and so we think we'll be in a good position there. We have no expectation of being able to buy fiber networks today, because right now it's still land rush, and you have private equity and the biggest banks in the world overpaying just to get into the space. So we
Right.
compete there. We'll wait and let this play out a little bit. When it comes to fixed wireless ISPs, when it comes to WISPs, we bought one in December. It's something we look at. That's really going to be a function of the people and the geography, and probably a fairly distant third, the nature of their network. It's really, we don't yet know whether having a WISP footprint really accelerates a fiber build or not. And I think as we learn more about that, we'll have a different view.
So, I mean, I can understand why you might buy a Wisp because of, like you said, the geography and all that. But in this specific case, can you tell me a bit more about who did you buy and where was it and
Oh,
why did you buy it?
we bought a company called Simply Bits in Tucson, Arizona. Um, that's a geography we're deeply interested in. If one of the, I think we're already involved with the Arizona Broadband Office, but if anybody from Arizona is on the call, reach out. I'm here. Um, and those were good entrepreneurs who had deep local roots. I said earlier, we think telecom is deeply a local business. At its perfect manifestation, you're in one of every 2 homes in a footprint, and you are therefore, and we think, by the way, these businesses are really self-sustaining as little footprints. When I say little footprints, they're
Hmm.
very big little footprints. You're in one of every 2 homes. You are probably the largest supplier in town outside of, heat, light, water, right? Um, and so, we look for people there who have deep local roots, who understand the local community. That's not, well, it's always nice to have political connections coming out of that. That's not what I mean there, but it's really understanding the landscape. Oh, over in that part of town, there's a builder who does, X, Y, and Z, or, over here, it's been traditionally underserved, or, whatever the case may be. It's that local knowledge. These are the local organizations. These people are doing great work supporting the community. we should lean into them. These people, they talk a lot, but they don't really deliver much. You should probably avoid them. That's gold, right?
Okay.
Because if you want to
Um,
have impact versus headlines, that's the way you got to think about it. So
well, I mean, generally, when you have fixed wireless, isn't it in areas that are difficult to get to with fiber?
no,
Uh,
um, not today, not yet,
Not today.
right?
Okay.
So today, fixed wireless tends to um, have a, relatively speaking, high business skew because it just saves businesses from having to deal with traditional telecom in many instances, and just generally the places you'll have a neighborhood with just a terribly oversubscribed cable plant that was built maybe 15 years before the rest of the cable plant, but they're not
Uh,
going to just upgrade that. There's all sorts of little
right.
idiosyncrasies. Fixed wireless wisps. Now, let me be clear: wisps have been golden for the unserved, for the more remote, for sure. All I'm saying here is not exclusively. So what
I
you have
see.
said is generally true, but there's lots of exceptions to it too.
Right. Okay. Um, so one thing I wanted to ask is just before this call, there was an email exchange, and someone said, "Let's just shut all the old was it copper networks
Copper
down or
network,
something?
yeah, yeah.
The incumbent," and you said no, and you said we're endeavoring to bring European financing approaches to the US.
Oh yeah, that's it.
I
Those are two unrelated points. So
I know, but
yeah,
still, we have some finance geeks, and I'd love
yeah,
to know what you mean. I did
sure.
interview Ben Bortry Jobson, so maybe I know what you mean from
No,
Sci-Fi
no,
Networks. Oh, you don't know
no.
him?
No. That's
That's different.
they are European. They are coming to they're trying, or they're
Yeah.
reporting to build in the U.S. But um,
So
no, I'm
you're referring
talking.
to something completely different.
Well, I think I don't know.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so in Europe, so still in the U.S., most funding is done, using traditional leverage multiples. You said there's finance geeks here, so you will have seen, the closest thing in the U.S. to what goes on in Europe has been probably the most recent Metronet financing, when there was a refinancing there recently, where they split their network into kind of mature and growth, and that allowed them to play around with the leverage ratios, with the EBITDA leverage multiples, which is the traditional underpinning of financing. What's been going on in Europe for years is what I would call true infrastructure financing, which looks a lot more like construction financing, where
Oh, right.
if you put that into a fiber context, where the financing, the ability to draw down on capital, is a function of the homes you pass and the customers you add on those homes. So think about that as um, the effectiveness of the construction company and the effectiveness of the
Right.
ISP. And so that they're not really looking at leverage multiples. They're taking their security in a number of other forms, but among them is the fact that they don't advance you all the money to build. They only advance you, much like you would in construction. You're putting up some money, they're putting up some money. So
So
they're
are you saying that you want to finance things more on a construction level rather than a media company approach?
no, it's not construction versus media company really. Um, it's construction versus traditional lending is what I'd call it.
Oh,
Typically as a
okay.
business, it's how much EBITDA do you generate, and then you can borrow some multiple of that EBITDA because that dictates your ability to service the debt. That doesn't
Oh,
work well with fiber because the faster you build, the more cash you'll burn in the short term. But there's so much equity being built up, in those homes. So it's just using a
right.
different basis. You know, it will be years. You know, if we can start doing this in North America, it will be years before that'll reach anywhere near what traditional construction financing is in terms of leverage, right? You know, if somebody's putting up a new condo, you'd probably be amazed at how little equity they have to put up. So, it's
Hmm.
really, it's just it's appropriate lending. I think it's what would I say? It's more accurately assessing the risk on the basis of the project.
So this is not no. I mean, I just know about this issue from looking at our maps, and we have these yield on cost maps. I don't know if you've seen them, but
Maybe, but not.
well, I'm kind
Yeah,
of
it
told
doesn't.
that
Yeah.
it's the construction approach. I thought that was the normal way of
You'll show me,
approaching.
so I can't say yes or no. You can show me
Oh,
offline,
okay.
and I'll tell you if it is.
All right. Okay. So here's a self-interested question. How do you manage? How do you plot out your coverage? Because our broadband money software, you can plot out your coverage and you can
Yeah,
use different data layers to see how much it's going to, these yield on cost statistics,
yeah,
how much. I mean, in our case, it's for people with grants,
yeah,
right? Like, how
yeah,
much is it going to cost you if you have a grant? How much
yeah.
of it
Sure.
if you don't? And also, then you can manage your customers, and you can also, um, do compliance things. You can.
Mhm.
So, do you have that? I
Uh,
mean,
well,
do you
so
have
it, yeah.
these kinds of mechanisms to manage your customers and plot out
No.
your
So we don't
oh,
for very
okay.
specific for very specific purpose. This will loop us back to equity.
Right.
Um, we believe deeply that fiber is infrastructure, and
Right.
we'll get it's sort of, it's almost like across the board people will agree with that statement. But then if you talk about something like build requirements,
Right.
people are like, of course there shouldn't be build requirements. And you can look at, still today, most fiber builds are cherry picking. They're often cherry
Right.
picking by demographics, but you
Right.
would be surprised at how still the vectors are less demographics and more race and other measures. You'd be shocked
I
when
would
we
be shocked.
when we go into a footprint. Um, we do our math on building the whole footprint. So, if we're going to do, city of Tucson, I mentioned Simply Bits in Tucson. We're going to build the whole, we're just going to decide to do the project or not, based on the whole footprint. The only
Mm.
exceptions to that might be physical. So when I say physical, there's a culvert, there's a train track, and here's 12 homes, and they're cut off and they'll be super expensive to build. You know what I mean? Something like that. But we're not applying a demographic filter to those 12 homes.
Okay.
And the thinking is simple. I started with saying, fiber is infrastructure, but we have a regulatory environment that is fighting the last war. So, I talked earlier about telephone and television and now fiber. So, telephone was always a regulated monopoly that was rate return adjusted. It was, rate managed. We are so far have forgotten that world. So when people were building telephone networks, you had to build the whole footprint. You wanted to be the person who built that network. That's what you did. That was the price of admission. In exchange for
Right.
that, you got a guaranteed return.
Right.
When it came to television, rightly, television was an entertainment product, not infrastructure. So those rules didn't apply. You then have the historical anachronism of fighting the last war. And so once internet was predominantly delivered on the infrastructure for cable, it then approximated the regulatory regime of cable, not telephone.
Right.
On top of that, I don't know if you were involved in all of the Title II stuff, but essentially broadband became unregulated. Now, my cohort, rightly, and I'm sort of okay with this when I say my cohort, early internet geeks who were fighting for an open internet, we liked that, right? Because it meant the government couldn't put their finger on the scale and favor incumbents and large companies. But what it also meant was companies were left to their own devices. So we just think it's the wrong way to go about it. We feel we can make loads of money building the whole footprint. We're happy to do so. We think it's better for the communities we, live and work in, and so that's what we do. So because of that, we're not. It's just not a filter for us.
What's not a filter for you?
Demographics, build cost, demographics. We'll look at the whole footprint. We'll decide if we can build the whole footprint, and that's what we do.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I have to ask you about the open internet, obviously, now that you've brought it up. What does it mean now, the open internet to you
For me,
in
that
2022?
look, it's a broad term, but I generally refer to that as standards-based internet based on protocols and very, very, basically mutual agreement, not governance. Now, a lot of people don't recognize that there is a tiny kernel, a tiny grain at the center of the open internet, which is heavily regulated. And that's in the ICANN world where we're deeply involved, right? But all that is regulating is IP addresses and domain names, right? So as long as the pointers have credibility, everything else can be built on top of it. So it's also the only example of true global governance, not international, but global governance in the world. And whole separate AMA again. But so the open internet to me means the standards-based internet built on top of that tiny kernel of centralization.
You mean open protocols, not proprietary protocols?
That's right.
Right. Okay. We've got a funny message here. It says, Elliot, it's Greg from Twitter. Did Parsons register GoDaddy.com on Tucows?
No.
Do you know what that's about?
Yeah. The short answer is no. Bob was an incredible entrepreneur, and we were not then and have not ever been the cheapest registrar. And I don't know or remember where he registered it initially, but what I would say there is that if I recall correctly, Bob built his registrar first. It was something called Jomax Technologies, and then he changed the name to Tucows. So that's an obscure. Clearly, Greg and I have just had a private conversation. So
yes, I have no idea what that was about. Wow, this is a broad question from Benjamin Kahn, one of our star reporters for Broadband Breakfast and Broadband Money. He asked, Elliot, how has the online landscape changed since you founded Tucows, and how has it remained the same? And what do you see as the most significant changes consumers can expect to see in the next 15 to 20 years?
So obviously that's a big, broad question. So I'm going to try and provide two simple frames. I think
or you could just take one part of it if you want.
Well, it's they fit together, so I'll do both. It's like over my time. So now if I'm looking backwards, there were always people attacking the open internet. In the earliest days, it was kind of everyone. You as you moved into the late 90s, early 2000s, it was intellectual property interests and to a great extent law enforcement and national governments and telecoms until they really got on board and sort of if we can't beat them, join them all through. You now have in many respects the walled gardens, and here, while I have mixed things to say. Here I'm talking about Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, Netflix, etc. You see in the W3C really for the last few years, but culminating now in kind of the mess that it's in. Them really sort of just capturing the standard setting process, favoring walled gardens over openness, favoring things like DRM, favoring all sorts of restrictions.
For those who don't think about standards, W3C is a World Wide Web consortium, and
it's essentially Tim Berners-Lee and the browser. So you want to think about it as, should the browser contain DRM or not? Should the browser
There's digital rights management.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
And so
should the browser know stuff about you potentially? Right. It has to have a certain level of knowledge about you to manage the rights.
Yeah, and
did you buy this song or not? Kind of
it's a complex area, and so I really just want to identify it's a great example of closed fighting open that exists in 2022.
Right. Yes.
Going forward, what do I see going forward? I'm a big believer in Web3, nothing to do really with what we see today, but Web3 being, holding the seeds of a really user-centric reemergence. I think that, in my thinking, in my frame, Web3 means to me, distributed ledger technology means to me the ability to do things with identity and money and governance. And those are the kind of the untrod ground yet. But I'm a deep believer in user-centric identity. If anybody wants to know what I mean there, go look up Kim Cameron's Laws of Identity. He did the world a great service. He passed recently. He did the world a great service, leaving us with that gift. That would be, to me, the 10 Commandments or the tablets around identity. And if we could wave a magic wand and live in a world with user-centric identity today, so much would go away. And I think you wouldn't be able to put the genie back in the bottle. And I deeply believe that Web3 can facilitate that. So I think that would be my answer.
Well, that would be another talk. So
we're up to, I'm keeping track, that's 6. So yeah.
I know Web3 is super complicated, and also I just feel like there are these environmental implications to it all, aren't there? Yeah. So
yes, I am a deep climate change sort of worrier, and I believe that those are way overblown, and in fact hold the seeds of really helping in that regard. But that's a controversial view. So.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for your time, Elliot, and it's been so great to meet you. I feel like we've, it's surprising we haven't met in person before.
We will.
Before we go, I'd like to remind our community that we have a special event on June 8th, I think it is, with the former staff member or leader at the NTIA, the National Telecommunications Information Administration, Scott Woods, who's just joined us at Broadband Money, and he's going to be unpacking the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act's Broadband Equity and Access Deployment Notice of Funding Opportunity. And that's going to be a webinar with telecompetitor Bernie Aronson next week. And that's going to be on June 8th. We've got details on the front of our page, discuss.broadband.money. Thank you so much. And Once again, Elliot, I hope we get to meet in person sometime and have fun at your son's graduation.
Well, thank you all for giving me the opportunity, and I've put that in my calendar for next week.